What would you think if you stepped onto an African island, heard the rhythm of drums, the pulse of waves, and then a whisper in the wind? That sounded unmistakably Asian. Not African, not Swahili, but something softer, more distant. You're standing on the red soil of Madagascar, one of Africa's largest islands. The wind carries village songs through the trees. But the language you hear, it isn't African, not Bantu, not Swahili. It's Austronesian, from the same family as Malay, Javanese, even Tagalog. How? How did a Southeast Asian tongue land on an island that sits just 400 kilometres off the African coast? Because here's the twist. Malagasy, the national language of Madagascar, is more closely related to the speech of boat builders along the Barito River in southern Borneo than to any language in mainland Africa. And we've known this not for decades, but for centuries. In 1613, Portuguese missionary Luis Mariano was the first to note the odd resemblance between Malagasy and Malay. By the 20th century, linguists like Otto Dempwolff and Alexander Adelar connected the dots. Malagasy belongs to the Southeast Barito subgroup of Austronesian languages, spoken nowhere else outside of Borneo. And then came the DNA. Mitochondrial studies tracing maternal ancestry found something astonishing. A genetic signal known as the Polynesian motif tied to Austronesian voyagers appears in Malagasy bloodlines, not a trace. A presence, strong, consistent, undeniable. Dating back 1,200 years. That means around 800 CE, women carrying Southeast Asian mitochondrial DNA, B401A1C, later called the Malagasy motif, made landfall on Madagascar. Not just one woman, a founding population, and they didn't come alone. Their language, their culture, their crops travelled with them. So now the paradox deepens. How did people from Borneo, 6,000 to 7,000 kilometres across the open Indian Ocean, reach Madagascar, while most of Africa had never heard of them? The textbooks don't explain this, and until recently even science couldn't. But the story is real, hidden in bones, words and blood. A forgotten migration, erased from maps, but not from genomes. Because the truth of this journey might not be written in geography. It's encrypted in the mitochondria of the women who never turned back. And that's exactly where science went next, not to maps, to mitochondria. Tiny organelles passed only by mothers to their children, unchanged, unbroken, across generations. In the 1990s, something strange began appearing in Malagasy mitochondrial DNA, a recurring genetic signature. One scientist called the Polynesian motif. This motif, known formally as haplogroup B401A1, had only been found across the Austronesian world, in the Pacific Islands, parts of Indonesia and coastal Southeast Asia. Until Madagascar. That was the first shock. Then came the second. In 2005, a team led by Dr. Matthew Hurls dug deeper. They fully sequenced the mtDNA of Malagasy individuals. What they found wasn't just a match to Polynesian or Southeast Asian lineages. It was a modified version, a branch never seen before. They named it the Malagasy motif, B401A1C. It had 2 additional mutations unique to Madagascar. This wasn't a borrowed strand. This was local. It evolved here after arrival. Its frequency? Up to 50% in some coastal Malagasy groups. Its age? Roughly 1,200 years, placing the arrival of these women around 800 CE. Good. And here's what that tells us. These weren't isolated visitors. They were founders. Not one woman, not 2, but a small intentional group, likely travelling together, who carried the future of a language, a culture and a genome across 7,000 kilometres of ocean. And they didn't just survive, they rooted. Their children spoke Ma'anyan, planted Asian rice, sailed in double outrigger canoes. The Malagasy were born from these mothers who remembered the stars of Borneo. But as deep as their genetic legacy runs, one question still haunts the records. Because when science mapped their maternal past, the fathers' origins didn't match. So who were the men that joined them? Were they fellow voyagers? Or strangers waiting on distant shores? Here's the twist. The ancestors of Madagascar may still exist today, but they no longer remember who they really are, and they no longer speak the language they gave away. In 2016, a groundbreaking genetic study by François K, Rico, Pradeep Tejati Kusuma, and Murray Cox changed everything. They weren't just comparing Madagascar's DNA to Southeast Asia in general. They drilled down, molecule by molecule, gene by gene. And the closest match wasn't the Malays. It wasn't Javanese. It was a small group in southern Borneo, barely known outside the region, the Banjar people. But here's where it gets surreal. Today, the Banjar speak Malay. They identify with broader Indonesian culture. They trade, farm, build and live in a language that dominates the region. But genetically, they carry the same deep southeast Burrito ancestry as the Ma'anyan people, the very root of the Malagasy language. The Banjar weren't just Malays. They were once Ma'anyan-speaking forest people who fused with incoming Malay traders during the expansion of the Srivijaya Empire between 700 and 1000 CE. And now that fusion has a face, and it's not in Borneo. It's in Madagascar. Because while the Banjar slowly lost their old identity, shifted languages and were folded into the Malay world, their voyaging ancestors left something behind. Not just bloodlines, but a time capsule. Across 7,000 kilometres of sea, Madagascar became the archive. The last place where the Ma'anyan voice still breathes. Let that sink in. A language that faded in its own homeland now survives, fully formed, in a country it had never seen. A language carried by migrants who vanished into history, but left their tongue echoing across oceans. So when we say Malagasy sounds like Borneo, it's not a coincidence. It's evidence, a memory preserved not in books or ruins, but in daily speech, in lullabies, in the very grammar of life. So what else did they preserve, if language survived 1,200 years? What about rituals, tools and burial rites? Could Madagascar be holding the last physical traces of a world Borneo forgot? No maps, no engines, no steel ships, just wood, rope and instinct. And yet they sailed from the rivers of Borneo to the shores of Madagascar, across 7,000 kilometres of unforgiving ocean. Before compasses, before sextants. They read the world through waves, through wind, through the flight paths of birds and the memory of stars. This wasn't a random drift. This was mastery. Austronesian voyagers, whom modern researchers call the greatest open sea navigators in human history, moved with purpose. They sailed in vessels called lakana, double outrigger canoes that danced atop the waves, light but strong, carved for distance. And they timed their departures with the monsoons. When the northeast winds blew west, they launched. When the southwest winds returned, they came back, or didn't. In 2003, modern scientists rebuilt one of these ancient ships, based on 8th century Indonesian carvings at Borobudur. They called it the Borobudur ship, and they sailed it 6,000 kilometres from Java to Madagascar, just to prove the impossible. It worked. No engines, no GPS, just wind, tradition, and everything they carried in memory. And not all who left returned. The ocean was a path and a grave. But those who made it, who stepped on to the untouched sands of Madagascar, they rewrote human history. Because the voyage wasn't just about getting there. It was about what they carried. Not gold, not conquest, but stories, seeds, instruments, customs, and a new beginning. What survives today in Madagascar, the rice fields, the rhythms, even the way they build boats, traces back to that voyage. But those weren't the only things they brought with them. There was something older, deeper, packed tightly into bundles, hidden inside fire pits, pressed into the ground. What if the earliest clues to this entire journey were not buried with the people, but with their plants? The first real proof didn't come from DNA. It came from the ashes of dinner. In 2016, on a windswept dig site in Madagascar, scientists sifted through ancient fire pits and found something that shouldn't have been there. Asian rice, mung beans, seeds scorched by flame, then sealed beneath earth for over 1,000 years. But these weren't native. These crops had never grown wild in Africa. They had to be brought across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. And they were. Charred, cracked, and blackened by time, they whispered the different kind of origin story. Because while bones decay, seeds endure. And they told archaeologists something stunning. The first farmers of Madagascar were not African. They were Austronesians, seafarers from Borneo who didn't just sail for survival, they sailed with memory. They didn't arrive with conquest, they arrived with culture, with agriculture. Asian rice didn't drift here by accident. It came packed in bundles, wrapped in banana leaves, soaked in myth. It crossed 7,000 kilometers of ocean, tucked into baskets woven by mothers who refused to forget their homeland. And when they stepped onto the red soil of Madagascar, they dug with purpose, not to extract, but to recreate, to rebuild their world, one seed at a time. And here's the twist, that world is still alive. Walk through Madagascar today, and you'll see rice terraces that look more like Indonesia than Africa. You'll find mung beans in kitchens where no African ancestor ever planted them. The Comoros show the same split, East African crops on the west side, Asian plants on the east, proof that the ocean didn't erase identity. It carried it. But that wasn't all they brought, because if their food survived the journey, maybe their rituals did too. What if they didn't just farm the land, but buried their dead in the same boats that carried their living across the sea? The same vessels that carried their dreams across oceans became their coffins. In a quiet forest clearing in Madagascar, archaeologists uncovered something bizarre. Wooden graves, long, narrow and gently curved. Not boxes, not coffins, canoes. At first they seemed symbolic, but when researchers looked closer, the connection became undeniable. This wasn't just a practical burial, it was a ritual echo, a cultural fingerprint left by people who saw life and death as part of the same voyage. Across the Austronesian world, from the Ifugao of the Philippines to the Toraja of Sulawesi, even in parts of ancient Polynesia, the dead were laid to rest in boats. Why? Because to them, the soul didn't just die, it journeyed. Death wasn't the end, it was another departure. And now, in Madagascar, an island thousands of kilometers away, that same belief surfaced in wood and bone. The discovery stunned researchers. Because how does a funerary custom from the highlands of Borneo appear unchanged on the shores of Africa? Even the positioning of the bodies, seated upright, hands across the chest, matched Austronesian burial rituals recorded over 1,000 years ago. But it didn't stop there. In Malagasy highland villages, flutes carved from bamboo play melodies nearly identical to Mayanyan ceremonial songs. The dances, circular, hypnotic, echoing the funeral processions of Southeast Asia. And the instruments, the valiha, a bamboo tube zither, still played today in Madagascar, is almost a twin of the Indonesian sasando. This island didn't just keep the language alive, it held onto the soul. Because while Banjar forgot and Borneo moved on, Madagascar became a living museum of a world lost to time. So if the music survived and the rituals endured, then what else crossed that sea? Could memory itself of gods, ancestors and spirits still be alive in Madagascar's highlands? And what if that memory didn't whisper in temples or carvings, but in conversation? Because while Borneo slowly forgot its ancestral voice, Madagascar kept it alive. In Borneo, the Maanyan language faded, buried under waves of trade, empire and assimilation. By the 20th century, it was nearly extinct, swallowed by the dominance of Malay. But in Madagascar, that same voice thrived. Malagasy, the national language of an African island, still echoes the grammar, tone and soul of Maanyan, a linguistic fossil still breathing. It wasn't just fragments, it was whole sentences, conjugations, metaphors, proverbs, proof that this wasn't a cultural borrowing, it was a full transplant, and it wasn't accidental. The first Austronesian settlers didn't just sail with tools and crops, they sailed with speech, with stories, with a worldview encoded in language, and passed from mother to child, generation after generation. But something else hides in the words. Sprinkled through Malagasy are loan words, terms borrowed from Old Malay, Javanese, even Sanskrit. Clues of trading stops, maybe temporary crewmates, but the core stayed Maanyan, a language that died in the land where it was born, but stayed alive 7,000 kilometres away. It's like finding a voice trapped in a bottle, floating across centuries. And that survival raises a deeper mystery. Because language can live without lineage. It can be adopted, inherited, even stolen. But what about the people? If the voice of the ancestors still speaks, is their DNA still inside the people who speak it? Or did their blood vanish, leaving only their grammar behind? And here comes the paradox. The people of Madagascar don't look like one place. They look like many. Sharp cheekbones like Southeast Asians, deep skin tones like mainland Africans, almond eyes, tight curls, side by side, sometimes in the same family. And yet, they share something deeper. In 2012, a genome-wide study shocked the world. It showed that the average Malagasy person carries roughly 50% African DNA and 50% Southeast Asian DNA. Split right down the centre. A perfect balance, born of migration and memory, but that's only the surface. Dig deeper into mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, and a pattern forms. In Madagascar's central highlands, most of the maternal DNA is Asian. In the coastal regions, it's reversed, mothers with African roots. Then comes the Y-DNA, the paternal line. And again, the pattern flips. Highland fathers, mostly African. Coastal fathers, often Southeast Asian. It's like the island itself remembers two migrations that met, intertwined, and began again. These weren't just gene pools mixing. They were people falling in love, cultures colliding, families forming under volcanoes and monsoon skies. And through them, something new was born. Not Asian, not African, but Malagasy, an identity built not from bloodlines, but from what happens when bloodlines cross. But here's the hard truth. When new identities rise, old ones sometimes disappear. Languages fade, clans dissolve, faces blend until you forget what came before. So the question now isn't just who they are, it's who they stopped being. In this fusion of ancestors, did Madagascar lose pieces of its past that can never be recovered? But what if those lost pieces never disappeared? What if they just stopped speaking and started whispering? In 2017, a team of geneticists led by Dr. Nathaniel Briccato tried something different. Instead of guessing ancestry by skin tone or language, they tested it, strand by strand, code by code. They ran comparisons between Malagasy DNA and over 2,000 genetic samples from Southeast Asia. And that's when the ghost appeared. It wasn't Malay. It wasn't Javanese. It wasn't even the dominant Malaysian. The closest match? A lesser-known group from South Borneo. The Banjar, not a tribe, but a fusion, a population formed in the trading port cities of the 10th to 13th centuries, where Malay sailors, Ma-Anyan-speaking farmers and Indonesian royalty intersected under Islamic sultanates and spice empire networks. The Banjar were born out of commerce, and they didn't just trade spices, they carried language, ritual, and bloodlines. Bricato's study didn't just confirm the Austronesian link, it refined it. It placed the source of Madagascar's Southeast Asian ancestry not in the myths of canoe people, but in the geopolitics of trade. Because these weren't random sailors, they were sent by kingdoms, by sultans, by the economic engine of maritime Southeast Asia, a place where a deal could move mountains or entire populations. And the twist? Today the Banjar barely remember this story, but the Malagasy still carry it in their genes. Every shared syllable, every mirrored melody, every genetic marker. A ghost, not erased, but embedded. So if trade left behind a living legacy, what did the empire destroy? In the rush to redraw maps and rewrite myths, what ancient kingdoms were wiped from history? Empires rise, fall, and erase. But habits, they hold on. Long after ports collapse and palaces crumble, a farmer still plants the same seed, in the same way, under the same moon. And in Madagascar, that seed was rice, not the African dryland kind, but flooded terraces, carved into hillsides, fed by hand-built canals. Step on to the highland slopes of Merina territory, and you'll see patterns that don't match their neighbours. They match Java, Bali, Luzon, wet rice agriculture, a system too complex to appear by accident. It had to be remembered, passed down, preserved. And that's just the beginning. In many Malagasy villages, the dead are buried beneath the homes of the living. Ancestors are fed, sung to, danced for, not just mourned, but kept close. A worldview not African in origin, but Austronesian. Even the way villages are laid out. Concentric circles with sacred central houses and communal rice granaries feels more like Borneo than Mozambique. This isn't just influence, it's an inheritance, not written in texts, but in action. Daily, quiet, ritual repetition, memory through motion, a mother teaching her daughter to plant, a family gathering to rewrap the bones of an elder, rice, ritual, rhythm. And through it all, a resilience that defied distance, 1,000 years, 2 continents, and still, it lives. But that raises a haunting question. Because if Madagascar preserved this much, when even the homeland forgot, could this island be the last untouched mirror of a vanished Austronesian world? A living fossil of a civilization that faded everywhere else? Some echoes don't fade. They bend through time, through wind, through generations that forget the names, but never the melody. In the highlands of Madagascar, a mother hums a lullaby. Simple, gentle, carried by voice, not text. Thousands of kilometres away in a remote corner of South Borneo, an old man carves a bamboo flute. It's shaped just like the ones found in Sulawesi, Mindanao and ancient Maluku. And when he plays it, the tune feels strangely familiar. How? How can two people, separated by an ocean, by centuries, know the same song? Because not all migration travels in silence. Madagascar didn't just inherit rice fields or funerary rituals, it inherited rhythm. It inherited voice. The Malagasy Valiha, a tube zither made from bamboo, traces its structure back to instruments played in the Philippines, Indonesia and Taiwan. Its songs echo the tempo of sea voyages, ancestor chants, planting ceremonies, the dances, the words, the oral histories whispered beside fires. They survived colonization. They survived conversion. They survived forgetting. What empire tried to bury, culture quietly kept alive. Because maybe the deepest part of us isn't our blood. It's our breath, our voice, the way we remember joy or grief through sound. So the question isn't just how far these people travelled, it's how far their memory still travels. In a flute, in a funeral chant, in the way a child hears a lullaby and somehow knows it's been sung before. If Madagascar remembers a world Southeast Asia forgot, then what else hides across the Pacific? What ancient voices still whisper in the islands beyond?